Welcome back. We're looking now into the Jewish world. And before you get too involved in this video, if you haven't already, you might want to go to the Moodle page and print out the document called The Jewish Context of the New Testament. I think you'll find that handout helpful. And if you kind of follow along, because I'll be following along the same handout here, you'll find you won't have to take as many notes. Now, I am fully aware that this is a course on the New Testament, not on the Old Testament. But I also feel that it's important that we have a sense of what the Old Testament story is about, because much of what happens in the New Testament is happening within a Jewish context and within a Jewish history that is established in the Old Testament. So I realize that many of you have not yet had Old Testament, and that's quite all right. You don't need to have that in order to be successful in New Testament. And some of you who have had Old Testament may not have realized all the connections to the New Testament that there is. Some of the things that are happening in the New Testament are rooted in the Old Testament. So striving for greater clarity. So this session is primarily focusing on a review of the Old Testament. And so again, let me encourage you to pull that handout and follow along. So if you want to hit pause, that is fine to do, and come back and join us when you have it ready. All right, let's go ahead and begin, and let me bring up the PowerPoint for this session. And in so doing, we see that the title here is The Old Testament Story of the Jewish Faith. And so I just have some basic pictures here, and nothing elaborate here, not a lot of words to copy. All the words are here on your handout. Of course, we begin at the very beginning, as I guess it was, who said that? Mary Poppins, or I don't know. No, Sound of Music. I don't know. I have all my pop references mixed up here. But we'll begin at the beginning, and we begin with creation. And so here we have the story of creation, that God created all things, Genesis affirms. And, you know, we can play this game if you like. If you could just use one word to describe the theme of the Bible, there's many choices. But one of the words that I think is a good one to use to describe the Bible is the Bible is a story of relationships. And we certainly see that established in Genesis 1 through 11. We don't understand exactly why God created, but God created. And so consequently, he created, and he created all living things. He created the world, and he created mankind. And he did that in the desire to have a relationship with us. And so that is kind of the story of creation here in the opening chapters. But of course, being who we are, that relationship gets broken by us. And so the rest of the Bible becomes a story of how God is seeking to continue to restore the relationship that we have broken. And so that makes a lot of sense. And so the Old Testament story is a story of how God seeks to use Israel to restore the broken relationship. And the New Testament becomes a story of how Jesus comes to restore the relationship. Now, while I'm sitting here in my library at home, it makes sense to maybe recommend some books to you. And let me just recommend this one, because it's just come out. It's one of my favorite New Testament theologians. And he, with Michael Bird, who's an Australian, have written the New Testament in its world. And so it's a pretty good, detailed, easy to understand introduction to the New Testament. And so here it is in its largeness. It is thick and it is big. Look impressive on your shelf, but it is an excellent book, and it is an easy read. So if you're looking for a textbook to kind of go along with what we're doing, you might find this helpful. And one of the things that Dr. Wright emphasizes here is the issue of relationships, and how he says the Bible is in acts. It's Act 1 is like a play. Act 1 is creation. Act 2 is the fall. Act 3 is the story of Israel. Act 4 is the story of Jesus and the church. So we have that. So the first way in which God in the Old Testament is seeking to restore our relationship is through the call of Abraham. And so that's our second point here. And so again, we don't know exactly how this happened. We don't have the details. But here God has called Abraham, go where I want you to go. And Abraham does. And this is rather remarkable, is it not? Who knew about God? What relationship had people had with God prior to this? And we know that Abraham's father was a pagan. And so in what context is Abraham responding? And so Abraham does. And then here's the amazing thing. Abraham becomes one of the great patriarchs, one of the great figures, not only in the Old Testament, but the New Testament. And in Judaism, who you are is dependent upon how far back you can trace your lineage. And as we will see in the Gospel of Matthew, for example, Jesus traces his lineage all the way back to Abraham. And so, you're saying you can't get much more Jewish. You can't be much more a part of the chosen people if you're somehow tied to Abraham. And so Abraham follows God, and of course he becomes the father of what becomes the Jewish faith. But also the great story of Abraham, and if you know the story, you know what I'm talking about here. But Abraham is also the father of Islam through Ishmael. And then, of course, through the Jewish lineage, we have Jesus, and Jesus, in a way, in a sense, is the founder of Christianity. And so Christianity, Islam, and Judaism can all find their traces back to Abraham. So it's a very dynamic story. And, if you're talking to someone of another faith, if you're talking to someone who might be Muslim, this would be a great conversation starter because we hold Abraham in commonality. And you might be surprised what you might learn about how other faiths view Jesus. So again, a lot to learn as we continue to think about relationship with other groups. Well, it's not long then before we get enslavement. We're told that, we have the great story of Jacob and his sons. The covenant continues through Jacob. And let me just say a word about covenant. Covenant is an agreement. Covenant is, I will do this if you do that. And so Abraham is the first to establish that covenant. If you follow me, God says, I will make you a great people. And so that's what Abraham does. And that covenant is renewed through Jacob and his sons. And through 4 wives, Jacob has 12 sons. And those 12 sons become the bedrock of what we come to know as the 12 tribes of Israel. And so one of those sons ended up in Egypt and became adopted by Egyptian household. And, excuse me, I'm overstating the case. I'm kind of getting my Moses story mixed up there. But one of those sons of Jacob, Joseph, becomes to the attention of the Pharaoh and is made second in charge of all the land because of his ability to interpret dreams. Well, one of those dreams that Pharaoh has is the story of the coming famine. And so through the famine, Joseph is ultimately reconciled with his family, and they end up in Egypt. And so the covenant family then, over generations and changes of pharaohs, we're told in scripture that there's a Pharaoh who does not know Joseph. We find the Hebrew people enslaved. And so that then leads us to deliverance. And so here we already see a microcosm of the story of the Bible. There's relationships broken, we're enslaved. Think about being enslaved to sin. And then what we need deliverance. And so in the story of the Old Testament, that deliverance, of course, comes through the person of Moses. And so here comes Moses, and this is a very interesting picture, isn't it? This is Michelangelo's Moses, and it's the horns are a mistranslation from the Septuagint, and we talked about that. But the Septuagint from the Latin Vulgate, just a translation of the Hebrew into Greek. The idea of rays, that's the scripture reads that rays, it's Exodus 34, I think, that rays shone out from Moses's head, and it got interpreted as horns. And so there were many depictions, and Michelangelo picked up on that, of Moses having horns on his head. But nevertheless, here we have the story of the 10 plagues. And the plagues culminate, that story culminates, of course, with the story of the Passover. And we'll go into this in greater detail later, but what's my point? The point is Jesus's last meal with his disciples. One of the last things he does is celebrate Passover with his disciples, and in the process, taking this feast of deliverance and interpreting it in a whole new and different way. So there's a wonderful connection there that we need to do and think about. The Gospel of Matthew, one of the things that the Gospel of Matthew does, many scholars believe, is it tries to present Jesus as the new Moses. Jesus comes, and so we see him, one of the most famous passages of Matthew is the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7. So you quickly see the parallel there. Moses goes up Mount Sinai to get the commandments. Jesus shares, and what do you hear from Jesus? You have heard it said, Moses says this, but I say unto you. So Jesus is giving a new interpretation to the law, to that which the Jews had held. So anyway, we have that part, and then also as a way to begin to understand how to worship God, what do we see? We see the people being taught how to worship through the establishment of the tabernacle, and the tabernacle, of course, becomes the temple. Well, as I indicated, because of Jacob and his 12 sons, we now have the establishment. There's a slide on the Passover, the breaking of the bread. We now have the story of settlement. So Joshua comes along, succeeds Moses. The people are organized around 12 tribes, primarily based on the 12 sons of Jacob. And consequently now we have the story of judges, that they don't have a king. They are now living according to the law that had been established. But what we see here in the story of the judges is that things don't go well. The country living as a theocracy, which means seeing God as the ruler, as the sovereign, there's just a continued downward spiral of conditions. The people become more and more wicked and become further apart from doing what they should. I should also point out that Joshua, of course, delivers the people into the promised land. How do they get there? They cross the Jordan River. And again, the parallel here with Jesus is clear. Jesus is baptized. His ministry begins in the Jordan River, baptized by John the Baptist. And again, a parallel here is that Joshua and Jesus are identical names in what they mean. They both mean the Lord is salvation. And so again, you see the parallel there. Well, turning to the second page here, the mantra in the book of Judges is the people did these things because they had no king. Be careful what you ask for, right? Because the people are given a king. So we now move from a theocracy to a monarchy. Here you have the three kings mentioned here in quick succession. We have King Saul, then King David, and then his son, King Solomon. And of course, David becomes the benchmark by which all future kings of Israel are judged. And David becomes idealized as the perfect king. Now, of course, we know the story of David, and we know that he was not a perfect king, but yet this is the picture that is presented in the Old Testament. And we see a new covenant. In 2 Samuel 7, you'll see the covenant that God makes with David, that there will always be a descendant of David that will rule on the throne. Well, go back to Matthew. What do we see there? In the genealogy, Jesus' lineage is traced back through, of course, ultimately to Abraham, as I just said. But on the way to Abraham, guess who we go through? David. And so David is kin to Jesus. And of course, as we continue to read the New Testament, what happens at the end of the Gospels? Jesus ascends into heaven and sits where? At the right hand of God. And so there we have that. I need to pause here for just a minute. I'm getting a message on my computer, and it's not plugged up, so let me get it plugged. All right, I told you this wasn't going to be smooth and easy and everything. So I, I was showing my wife some of the stuff I had done, especially in the last video about drawing, and she just sat there and laughed. So maybe you all are getting some entertainment out of all my issues and problems and difficulties here. All right, so with the monarchy and with Solomon in particular, we have the greatest thing that Solomon does, of course, is the building of the temple. And of course, the temple becomes the representation of God on earth. One of the things I appreciate about Dr. Wright is he helped me come to understand about the distinction between heaven and earth. Is that from a Jewish theological point of view, with the temple, God from heaven has come to be on earth. And so we have this representation of heaven on earth through the temple. And so that's a very interesting concept. What I want to do in class with you when we come together again is to talk in greater detail about the temple, kind of draw on the board, kind of giving up on the whiteboard I have, but kind of working a little bit on the board and kind of giving you a little bit more detail about the temple and about the importance and of the temple in daily Jewish life. Well, things don't go well. And what we ultimately now have, oh, excuse me. I need to review my slides a little bit better. This is a picture of Israel today, and the reason I didn't have this there is because I just didn't talk about the temple. But while it's up here, let me go ahead and say a word. This is the Dome of the Rock, and it's the idealistic picture of Jerusalem. If you see a picture of Jerusalem and see this in the skyline, you know you're looking at Jerusalem. This is a mosque that's been built where we think the temple stood. And so it's a very sacred site. In fact, it's the third most holy site in all of Islam. It's believed to be from this site that Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, ascended unto heaven. And so the other two sacred sites are in Saudi Arabia. And so this is a very holy site built approximately around the year 1000. And so this has been standing there for over 1,000 years. And so the question, why hasn't the temple been rebuilt? And this is why. All right, moving on. In the history that we have here, after Solomon's reign, the people were looking for some kind of relief. And Solomon's descendants said, no, there's not going to be any relief. And so the country fractures. So we now have a north and south. The northern country was known as Israel, and the southern country was known as Judah. Okay? And so now we have two kingdoms. And so now for a good long while, we have issues related to Israel and issues related to Judah. As you will see, Israel is destroyed eventually because of the Assyrian crisis. And so as we look on the world stage of who's in charge, Assyria comes to the forefront. And again, geographically, and we'll do geography later, but Israel would have been the first country that Assyria would come to. Judah would be buffered by Israel, and of course to the south of Judah would be Egypt. So anyway, as you see on your notes there, we have the Assyrian crisis that comes about in the 8th century BCE. Then, of course, we'll have the country of Israel destroyed. The tribes there will be dispersed. That was the Assyrian way of doing things, that we put people enslaved and we remove them from their land so they don't feel an obligation to defend it anymore. We mix them with other groups. And so sometimes this is referred to as the lost tribes of Israel. And so off they go, never to be heard of again. All right. So then that leaves just Judah. And then Judah will experience their own crisis in 586 with the Babylonians. So the Babylonians will come and take over as the leading empire over the Assyrians, and then we'll have the Babylonian exile. So let's look at those slides real quick. And in that context, then as we see that, what we also see is that during this time is we see the rise of the prophets. So there's prophets in both Israel, and then later there's prophets in Judah, and sometimes there's prophets in both places at the same time before the Assyrian crisis there. And again, what I just want to remind you here is what a prophet does. If we had time in class to talk about this, and of course we can if you want to, but if I ask you what a prophet did, you might say they tell the future. Well, they tell the future only in the case of this is what's going to happen if you don't do what God wants you to do. Okay, they're not soothsayers in the saying, well, tomorrow's there's going to be an eclipse of the sun, or you're going to have a car accident on the way to work, or anything like that. It's not telling the future in that regard. The prophet is there as a representative of God. Thus saith the Lord. Okay? Thus saith the Lord. And this is what you need to do. And so the prophet is calling the people to repentance. And they're saying, if you don't repent, if you don't change your ways, and what ways did they need to change? Well, primarily, what are they doing? They're idolaters. They're turning away from God, and they're worshiping other things and other idols. And they say, if you don't stop doing that, God's going to punish you. And so the Old Testament lesson is that the Assyrians were sent to Israel to punish Israel, and the Babylonians were sent to Judah to punish those in Judah. So we have that, and again, things don't turn out well. We have an exile. And so now we come to one of the important things to kind of think about. If, again, in a summary like this, if we're thinking about how do I characterize, how do I come to understand the story of the Jewish people? Two words: the Exodus. We were enslaved. God rescued us. Okay? And so we have the period of the Exodus, and now just what we just said, we have the establishment of a monarchy, we have the building of the temple, God comes, heaven comes to earth, God lives among us, but yet we turn away from him. And what happens? We have problem after problem after problem until, guess what? The full cycle of history occurs. We are now exiled. We're out of here. We're enslaved again. The story has come full circle. Well, during the exile, it's now appropriate to call the people of Israel, or the Hebrew people, or the people who used to live in the north and the south, Jews. Because in Babylon, they were simply known as the people of Judah. And that got abbreviated to Jew. Well, it's also here in the exile that the people adapted their language from Hebrew into assimilating the Babylonian language and the language of other people groups. And that formed the basis of what we know as Aramaic. And so when the people return home, eventually, then Aramaic has become the language of the time. Well, this is a amazing period of time of exile. We can read the Psalms. How can we sing songs of the Lord in a strange foreign land? We sit by the river and we weep for what we remember. And again, God is faithful. God sends prophets. And one of the great prophets of the exile is Ezekiel. Remember him? It's a good story to tell at Halloween, right? Because he has that great vision of the bones coming up from the grave. Can these people live again? And the answer is yes, they can. And so God, in his mercy, after several generations, allows the people to return. But they have done some severe soul searching during this exile period. And one of the things they have tried to figure out is, how do we worship God? How do we come together? Because the temple's not here. And so what they invent during the exile is the synagogue. And again, I'm going to hold a further discussion of the synagogue until we come together in class, because I think our understanding of the synagogue would be enriched by more of a engaging class discussion. So let me just encourage you to think about those two things as we prepare for class. What do you know about the temple? What do you know about the synagogue? And how do we understand those two? All right, so the Jews return, they resettle, and of course some resettle and some don't. And so here's a good word for you to know, is diaspora. It just simply means a scattering. And so here again, I'm showing you the map that we had looked at earlier when we were talking about the canon. So here you can immediately pick out Italy, can you not? That's the shape of a boot in the upper left-hand corner of the map. But you see they're returning to Jerusalem, but some people did not return. Some people stayed in Babylon. Some people went elsewhere. And so this explains, when we get into the story of the New Testament, is that we find Jewish communities, we find Jewish synagogues throughout the ancient world. And so when Paul does all that traveling and he goes into a city and he says, I've got good news, the Messiah has come, who does he tell that to? He tells it to the Jews in that area. Where does he find them? He finds them in the synagogue. All right? Makes sense? And then we have also, why are all these people coming to Jerusalem in the New Testament? Because if you were a good Jew, the requirement was that you would come to Jerusalem at least once a year to pay your temple tax. And to do what? To offer sacrifice. For it's only at the temple you can offer sacrifice. So when the people returned, they rebuilt the temple. So we have the first temple that Solomon built, destroyed by the Babylonians. We have the second temple now rebuilt upon return, and that comes under Ezra and Nehemiah. And so we have the second temple rebuilt. And so we talk about the second temple period. It's from this period of return from exile until 70. And of course, as we already know, the Romans will come and destroy Jerusalem and the temple at that time. And of course, the temple has yet to be rebuilt. And why is that the case? Since, Israel's been back in the country since 1948. Why haven't they built a temple? Because of the Dome of the Rock that is sitting there. So again, hopefully a lot of these things are kind of coming together. And if you haven't put this together before, maybe you're having some aha moments as we think about some of these things. Well, let's wind up, okay? And so how would we kind of identify, what are some best words that kind of identify for us who the Jewish people are? Well, the Jewish people were identified as a people of a covenant. They had entered into this relationship with God. They were unique. They were special. They were a people who were following the law. And again, when we're reading in the New Testament about the law, we're talking about the first 5 books of the Old Testament, also known as the Torah or the Pentateuch, okay? It's in the law that we're told how we maintain the covenant and how we relate to God. And so Jesus will encounter all the Pharisees, and they will be upset with Jesus. Why? Because in their opinion, he's breaking the law. And so that for an obedient Jew is that we want to follow the law. Third, there's this idea that we're special, we're unique. We have been selected by God to do God's work. And so this idea of being God's elect, God's chosen people, and then of course the way that we identify ourselves through the covenant and being part of God's people and obedient to the law is that the males had a mark of circumcision. So this was seen as the mark of the covenant. And again, this is prominent throughout the Old Testament, and it will become a major issue in the New Testament because the question is, how does one become a follower of Jesus? And they will say, some, you have to be circumcised first, you have to follow the law, you have to go to the temple. And we're going to have Paul who says, I don't think so. So again, interesting discussions. And of course, in the world in which the Jews and early Christians lived, this belief in monotheism was radical. And so that is very much part of the story as well that we will deal with. Well, are you sitting down? This kind of throws students sometimes, but sometimes it doesn't. But here's my point. We know about the Jews, but have we ever stopped to think in the New Testament who were the Jews? Well, the prime character in the Gospels was a Jew, and that prime character, of course, was Jesus himself. Jesus came as the Messiah. And from a Jewish perspective, they were looking for the Messiah. And they're kind of going back and saying, we want someone who was like King David. And so one of the things we will see is that Jesus is going to be identified as the Messiah, which by default means Jesus was also a Jew. Now, make no mistake about it, Jesus' lineage, his parents, he's circumcised, he goes to the temple, he teaches in the synagogue, he's confronted by the Pharisees, he's tried by the Sanhedrin, and even at his death, what happens? There's a sign on the cross, and it lists him as He is King of the Jews. So our Christian heritage, our Christian understanding of what it means to be a follower of Jesus is very much planted, rooted, bathed in Judaism. And so I hope this brief overview has been helpful to you, and you're beginning to see and make some connections of how the Jewish world impacted the New Testament world. And what we'll do in the next video, of course, is go deeper into an understanding of the Jewish structure and belief system as we come to better understand some of the issues that we will encounter in the text itself. So I hope this has been helpful to you, certainly shorter than the previous two. So we might be getting the hang of it in terms of length, but the content dictates the length. But be thinking about the temple and the synagogue. And we'll talk about those two things as we come to class when we meet this week. Hope you're doing well. Hope you're safe. Again, any questions or issues, don't hesitate to let me know. Take care. We'll see you later. Bye now.